The Miller, a man of very sour disposition.
Hello. I've talked quite a bit on this show about my first 3 novelizations purchased for me on Super Bowl Sunday 1985. Novelizations of the Moonbase, episode 12 of this podcast, The Invasion of Time, episode 54, and Destiny of the Daleks, episode 51. And you've heard me talk as well about my second 3 novelizations, purchased for me 2 weeks later, Novelizations of an Unearthly Child, episode 65, The Demons, episode 8, and the topic of this week's show, Doctor Who and the Visitation, episode 70, this episode. What I really wanted to buy that day, of course, was the novelization of Logopolis, which I had started reading from a friend's copy but hadn't finished. I hadn't yet heard of the Visitation as a TV story, but the mention of Tegan on the back cover led me to at least hope that the book would mention the events of Logopolis. Oh, and the front cover grabbed me, too. Insert record scratch sound here. Yes, I know what you're thinking. What are you, Jason, on drugs? A couple of things I've learned from the Doctor Who Target Books Facebook group. 1, every book, no matter how short or how unpopular, is always going to be someone's favorite. And 2, cover photos cannot compete with cover paintings. In fact, on the day that I recorded this cold open, there was a pile-on post harshing on the poor old Modern Undead cover. I like that cover, which we'll get to here eventually. As for Doctor Who and the Visitation, this is the first novelization of the Peter Davison era, coming out just 6 months after the TV serial. It was the second Davison story produced, and the 4th aired, but the first one to hit the shelves, and the first Target book to not feature a cover painting. The story goes that Peter Davison's agent objected to the likeness of his client as painted. You'll hear more about that story later. No Target book of the original run, excepting the later Blue Spine editions, would feature Davison via painting. Only cover photos for most of the Seasons 19 and 20 novelizations, and for a couple of Season 20 stories, a photo pop-up of Davison inside the Neon Tube logo, over a cover painting of some other non-Peter Davison element of the story. I like that logo too, BT dubs, as the kids say. The kids don't say that anymore, I'm being told. Here's the thing though. I love the cover of The Visitation. Absolutely love it. No matter how unoriginal, no matter how unpopular. For one thing, there's that appealing cover photo of Peter, presumably taken on location from the story, in Black Park, in front of the TARDIS prop. The cover color is a deep blue, and the Neon Tube logo is orange, outlined in white. What are those colors? Orange and blue. The official colors of New York State, where I lived then and live now, and the official colors of my favorite baseball team, as memorialized in the team's 1963 fight song, which any fan of the New York Metropolitans still knows by heart today.
All the fans are true to the orange and blue, so hurry up and come on down, 'cause we got ourselves a ball club, the Mets of New York town. Come on and meet the Mets, meet the Mets. Step right up and greet the Mets.
And yes, you can be sure my daughter knew all the words to that song before she was 3 years old. Baseball connection or not, this cover sings to me. It was my first Davison novelization. I devoured the book, plowed through it, and it's still one of the Targets I've read the most today, almost 40 years later. Never mind that it is a short book, only 113 pages of text. Never mind that of Eric Sayward's 6 total Doctor Who novelizations, including his 2 21st century Dalek books, this is the only one that I'd run back into a burning building to save. This book is one of my most valued Doctor Who possessions.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who Podcast Network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Why is this episode different from all other episodes? As this is released, it is the middle of Passover and I am out of town, so this is a pre-recorded episode made several days in advance. And incidentally, a happy Easter Sunday to all of you at home. There is some news in the Doctor Who universe. A new casting announcement was made this week. I will discuss that with my guest coming up in the later part of the show. In terms of other appearances, we talked a little bit last week about where else you can find me on Doctor Who podcasts. Those of you who also subscribe to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast will know that the Visitation episode was released last Sunday, so you are getting 2 episodes about the Visitation in back-to-back weeks. The guest on last week's episode of the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, Jim Sangster, is also going to be on next week's episode of Doctor Who Literature. The week after that, I will be appearing on the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, and 2 weeks after that, Jim Sangster is going to be back on the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast. So our 2 little Target-based shows are in very nice synchronization this month. This week, we are talking about, as I told you in the cold open, Doctor Who and the Visitation, the 70th book, put out by Target. We've come a long way, and talking about it with me is the godfather of this show, Mark McManus from the Trap One podcast. Mark and I are going to talk about quite a bit of things, including the Visitation. We are going to play an uproarious game of 20 questions. We are going to talk about some news, and we are going to talk about some current events, although by the time many of you listen to this episode, those current events may be stale, and the news may no longer be news, but it will be preserved in amber. So, let's get to it.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, the only podcast to discuss, in story order, all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Whitt, and every 2 weeks or so, I'm joined by a 2 to 3 person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. We also get the views of intermediate, casual, and novice fans who either have never seen the show or who have never read these books until these podcasts, including
Dalton Hughes
and
Alison Fitz-Seyfried.
You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find good podcasts, or even ones like ours. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Enjoy your travels.
So, Mark, before we talk about this week's book, I was on your show, Trap One, a few days ago, talking about the Season 2 William Hartnell Blu-ray collection. So we were talking about that just before we started recording. Have you had a chance to listen to that yet, and what did you think of the Season 2 Blu-ray?
I have. I haven't watched the Season 2 Blu-ray yet, unfortunately, because I am planning this year to do a pilgrimage, as you did during lockdown. But but I haven't got very far so far. I've only watched the first 4 episodes of Doctor Who, so it's stalled a bit. It's stalled, and it's partly because I keep watching other stories for podcasts and things like that. And I've got really into The Last of Us and various non-Doctor Who TV shows. So my plan is to watch the Season 2 Blu-ray as after I finish Season 1 in my very, very slow-moving pilgrimage. But I have listened to the podcast, and I thought it was an excellent discussion. Obviously, I'm familiar with the stories, and I have watched the David Whittaker documentary off the set. That's the only thing I've watched on it so far, and I thought that was excellent. And I'm very much looking forward to Simon Guerrier's book about David Whittaker that's coming out, which has got some really tantalising hints in that documentary about it.
Yeah, I saw Simon speak at Galley in Los Angeles about 6 weeks ago now, and he has uncovered even more information since that documentary was cut because he now has a lot more information about the actors and artists that David Whittaker knew who all wound up appearing in Doctor Who, primarily overlapping his run. Like one of his good friends ended up appearing in The Gunfighters. His wife's maid of honor ended up appearing in two early Hartnell episodes, one of which is on the Blu-ray. So that's all sorts of interesting stuff. He had been an actor, so David Whittaker's connections ended up getting on early
Ah,
Doctor Who. So the speculation is that he had a lot of say, along with the directors, into who got cast for which episode, because his Rolodex is almost a who's who of who appears during his era
yeah.
of Doctor Who. And that the documentary didn't get so much into that, so I imagine this is all stuff that Simon Gurrier learned after that documentary had wrapped.
Yeah, and Simon Guerrier wrote the Doctor Who magazine review of the new illustrated edition of Doctor Who: The Daleks as well, and he there's some information in that which again isn't in the documentary, but is obviously the results of his research for the book. So again, it's just really whetted my appetite for the book.
And speaking of whetting your appetite, you are going to be on a lot of other podcasts coming up. I was talking last week and this week about how I've been on a cluster of other podcasts over the last 10 days. I've recorded a lot over the last 10 days for this show, your show, Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, Gallifrey's Most Wanted. Your dance card puts mine to shame because I think you're doing a different podcast every day for like 3 straight weeks. Where else can we hear you?
Yeah, so things are a little bit quiet with Trap One at the moment because our sort of remit is sort of new releases a lot of the time, isn't it? It's sort of the stories as they come out on vinyl or they're animated or the collections come out or new books come out. But obviously the first half of this year is fairly quiet. I think we're going to be very busy in the second half of this anniversary year with book releases, and obviously there's new episodes and there's Doomsday and all sorts of things like that, and Big Finish are doing their 60th series. So yeah, I can be found on Gallifrey's Most Wanted, where I'm going to do a Christmas special, which is one of my favorite Christmas specials, and also our ongoing series that me and Ross do is called The Comic Shop, where we look at some Doctor Who comic stories. We've done some of the really big hitters, and we've got the Sixth Doctor one, Voyager, coming up as well, which I'm really looking forward to revisiting and recording. We're starting up again on Maximum Power, the Big Finish podcast, fairly soon with the third series of that, which I've never seen any Blake Seven, so I'm the kind of the newbie on that one. So my reactions are all as a first time viewer. And funny enough, I've just got the season 9 Blu-ray collection has just been released over here, and I've already been warned not to watch the Michael E. Bryant documentary on it because there'll be spoilers for episodes of Blake 7 I haven't seen yet. So so when I do the Trap One review of that, I won't be able to talk about that documentary for a little while.
And you said Big Finish podcast. I think you mean to say the Blake's 7 podcast.
Oh, so did I? Oh, I don't know why I said that. So yeah, so Maximum Power, the Blake 7 podcast. Yeah, yeah. We don't talk about Big Finish on there. Well, actually, I think I think might be plans to maybe cover some of the Blake 7 Big Finish releases at some point. Hopefully that's not a spoiler. I'll be in trouble from Si if it is. And also Dave Rennie's podcast, A Kettle and Some String. I'm going to be making a debut appearance on soon as well.
So that keeps you very busy. And yeah, coming up this year, we're going to have new Target releases. We're going to have Cy Hart talked about it here a couple of weeks ago. He's going to be doing a look at all the anniversary stories for this anniversary year. And there's
Yes.
2 bits of Doctor Who news in the last 30 days. We should address it here briefly. Now, bearing in mind that most of the folks who listen to my podcast listen to it in the future, I have a certain number of people that I can rely on to download the show on day one. I usually double that number by the end of the first week, but I have a lot of hits coming in after the fact as people discover the show. Also, I go at a weekly pace, and not everybody can spare me 90 minutes a week. So some people listen to it at their convenience rather than at mine, which is a long way of saying that. Hello, if you're listening to this, it is 2023. We're recording this on the day that Donald Trump was indicted in New York City for a whole string of 34 felony/financial crimes. I have a cat on my keyboard, Smudge, and if you've listened to any episode of the show, you probably have had Smudge literally on my lap or staring into the camera at my guest. And also, this is the period in time when we just learned about Doctor Who Doomsday, the second multimedia presentation following on the heels of Time Lord Victorious. You, coming to us from the future, have probably experienced all of Doomsday already, but Mark and I are only reacting to mock-up photos and very preliminary press releases. And we also had new casting news yesterday that they cast an American performer to be in a quote-unquote major role in the new Russell T Davies, I guess that would be Series 14, the first Ncuti Gatwa series, rather than the brief David Tennant return that's coming up later in 2023. These would be 2024 episodes. You in the future may have already seen these episodes. You may know which character this performer is going to be playing. We do not. Mark, what is your reaction to what is for you and me news and what is for much of my audience old news?
So yeah, in terms of Doomsday, like you say, it's going to be a multimedia story where it seems like it's from the trailer and from some of the titles, it's sort of 24 hours. It's Doomsday with the character Doom having 24 hours to find the Doctor to save herself. She's been hunted by death, I think. The Grim Reaper, which is interesting because it's going to tie into an element of the book we're going to talk about today.
That's right.
And I think just today or yesterday, they've announced a novel which is going to come out as part of it from Penguin Publishing. And the title just seems to be Hours 14 to 11 or something. I'm not sure I've got that quite right, but it seems like it's the title is the chunk of the 24 hours that is going to be covered by this book. And I think M.G. Morris, I think, is the writer. I might be getting that slightly wrong. But yeah, it wasn't a writer that I've come across before. So yeah, it's good that kind of seems like new talent is being brought in as well through this project. So yeah, that's been announced. There's going to be a big Finnish production. There's going to be an audio book, I think, from just sort of BBC Audio. There's comics from Titan and Doctor Who magazine. So yeah, it's all exciting. But again, it's all in the second half of the year, isn't it?
Right. So we're going to have probably at least an episode a week between July and December. But for now, the field is pretty fallow. So what's your reaction to the new casting news? I do have to confess, I have very bland and vanilla interests, and this was not a performer that I'd ever heard of, although I'm willing to bet that I'm the only person in my household who's never heard of them. What's your take on the new casting?
Yeah, so this is Jinx Monsoon. This was there was a sort of a cryptic tweet in the manner that they have been since before the casting of Ncuti Gatwa, where they do the emojis, the two hearts, and the addition sign, and then the sort of the diamond, wasn't it, for the diamond logo and different things. And this time it was sort of like a storm cloud, and then it was the announcement sort of later on that it is two-time RuPaul's Drag Race winner Jinx Monsoon, which I have to admit as well, it's not a TV show that I'm familiar with at all. So I'm not familiar with the performer or anything like that. So it's very, very, very interesting in terms of everything that's going on. I think in both of our countries at the moment, where the right wing are objecting very strongly to drag, which I think seems particularly strange here. I don't know what it's like in America, but we've had kind of drag performance on TV for certainly for as long as I can remember and before I was born. So it's in no way kind of new or unusual. And in fact, one of the most famous ones was Paul O'Grady, who played Lily Savage over here just sadly died last week, very, very unexpectedly, very suddenly young. Paul O'Grady actually appeared in The Stolen Earth, I think, very briefly. He's one of these sort of RTD cameos, when they do sort of like when they're switching between TV channels.
Oh, yes.
Not in character as Lily Savage, but sort of later in his career, did sort of chat shows and different things as Paul O'Grady. But yeah, Lily Savage was a huge presence, was all over TV, when I was younger, and hosted game shows and things like that. So the idea that suddenly, drag performers suddenly sort of taking over and corrupting youth and stuff like that seems particularly strange here, because it's kind of always been around on TV. I've had like Dame Edna and just tons of characters like that in the mainstream.
So it's pretty interesting you mentioned that, because especially in the southern United States, you have this really extreme moral panic being aimed at drag performers. So one of the southern governors who is trying to criminalize all sorts of drag related behavior, a photo surfaced of that governor in drag, I think, when they were performing in a college show. So it's very prevalent here. Now, again, all that I know about Jinx Monsoon is what I read on Wikipedia before we hopped on this recording. But what I find interesting is the character took their drag name from a character in UK pop culture whose last name is Monsoon. So there's a lot of cross pollination there. This person is clearly a fan of later era BBC television.
Right. Oh, I don't know who that is. But yeah, just thinking then when you're speaking, it seems like in this country, even when you think about like when Shakespeare was plays were being performed in his lifetime, women weren't allowed to be actors. So, every female character on stage then was a male actor in drag. And then over here we've got pantomime as well, which has got a really huge history in it. And even at the moment, Syria McKellen, I believe, is either still or very recently on tour as Widow Twankey. So it's it seems strange that we're sort of maybe importing that moral panic when it's very it's a very kind of mainstream thing over here.
I mean, the Broadway show, the movie, and then the movie version of the Broadway show, Hairspray, features a prominent drag role. Harvey Fierstein on Broadway, and then John Travolta in the movie version of the Broadway musical. In the long-running Broadway show Chicago, in which Jinx Monsoon has recently appeared, there's another drag role, not the one that Jinx Monsoon played, but a second drag role in that play. So, not to mention all of Some Like It Hot, which is currently playing on Broadway. I saw that a few months ago, which was a major motion picture in the 1950s with Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe. But yeah, the last name Monsoon is evidently drawn from a little-known UK production called Absolutely Fabulous. Do I have that right?
Right. Yeah, I never watched that. That's could well be one of the one of the characters in that. I never saw it.
So yeah, it's interesting that what RTD is doing now is between Yasmin Finney and Jinx Monsoon, RTD seems to be going out of his way to say, if you are going to criminalize this, I am putting it front and center on my show.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but now Doctor Who has a distribution deal in the United States. We have another Southern governor who has sort of tried to nationalize Disney World and make it a state property, and now Disney is going to be running a show that has Yasmin Finney in it and a show that has Jinx Monsoon in it. So RTD is definitely bringing the fight to the culture war. It'll be very interesting to see how the episodes play out.
Definitely, yeah, excellent. No, I think RTD's on the right side of things, and he's been very vocal in his criticism of our government and the things like that over here. And I suppose whether the sort of the co-production deal with Bad Wolf, gives him a little bit more latitude than if he was, I suppose, a BBC employee. Maybe he's able to speak out a bit more. But it's good to see somebody using their platform in that way, I think.
All of which is to say that the book that we are talking about today, 1982's Doctor Who and the Visitation, based on the Doctor Who TV serial of the same year, is one of many, many, many Doctor Who episodes in which there are 0 female artists in the guest cast. The only female artists in all of the Visitation are the companions, Tegan and Nyssa. And this is something that was a very, very, very Doctor Who trope. For the longest time, you would have, I don't know the exact percentage, that would be an interesting survey. It is probably fair to say that at least half of the classic series serials have no female artists other than companions or regulars. The Mutants, only female character, Jo Grant. And much of season 13, the only female performer for most of season 13 is Sarah Jane Smith. The Visitation, only female performers are Tegan and Nyssa. So this is a story that has 0 connection to the pop culture topics that we've been discussing at the top of the hour. This is a very early 80s insular, safe Doctor Who production with 0 political overtones. So when did you first see The Visitation? I know you're a little bit younger than me, so you probably saw it much later than I did, given the limited rerun schedule in the UK.
I don't remember the first time I saw it. I definitely would have read the book first. So it would either have been a UK Gold showing, which my auntie used to record the omnibuses on a Sunday morning for me, or I would have got it when the VHS came out. But I would say it must be. I was thinking about this. I think it's one of the earlier Peter Davison ones I saw, because I always think for a long time I always really associated Peter Davison stories being in kind of very kind of rural settings like that, like surrounded by greenery, which I think Castrovalva's got a bit of that. And so does, I suppose, stories like The Awakening. But this is the one where they're really just sort of out in the countryside and in the woods a lot. So I think this is probably one of the Peter Davison stories that really kind of formed that opinion for me, because it's definitely, just kind of an association I have with him. So, I don't specifically remember the first time I saw it, but I think that's probably the kind of the lasting impression that it's gave me of his whole era.
There was a lot of outdoor location shooting in the Davison era. Castrovalva, parts 2, 3, and 4 take place in the woods. Visitation, a lot of it takes place in Black Park, which had also been a location earlier in season 18. So it was not the first time that Doctor Who had been there. And Star Wars Andor had recently filmed in Black Park as well. So it's quite possible that the cast of Andor was treading the exact ground that our heroes were treading in Castrovalva.
Yeah, the making of documentary. They talk about they used to film there because it was within 25 minutes of the TV centre, so they didn't have to. They weren't obliged to put the actors up and the crew up overnight. So it was a nice cheap place to film. They also talk about, unfortunately, it's under a flight path. I can't remember which airport it's under a flight path from. So they did have to keep stopping the takes when a plane flew overhead because it was really noisy. But I think they talk about that on the third day there was an air traffic controller strike, so they were able to catch up on all the filming that they'd fallen behind with on the previous 2 days because of all the air traffic.
And which edition of the novelization do you have? This book sold like bananas because I have the 1984 edition. That's the 4th edition. This book was printed 3 times alone, 3 printings just in 1982. So I think the combination of the cover, which has Peter Davison, the brand new Doctor, this book may have been the best-selling Doctor Who book of 1982. I'm almost positive, just on the number of printings alone.
Yeah, mine says 1982, and it says reprinted in 1982 twice. So I guess
you have the 3rd edition.
The 3rd edition, yeah. And this is, as you say, it's got the photographic cover with a little banner that says a BBC TV programme with Peter Davison as the Doctor. And you probably already know this, but there's a piece in the Complete History where it talks about David McAllister had produced a painting which depicts the Doctor, the death version of the android, and the Pterolepto leader against a blazing backdrop. And there's a little image of it, which it does look quite cool. But unfortunately, Peter Davison disliked the likeness of him, a view also held by John Nathan Turner. As a result, W.H. Allen dropped the painting and substituted a publicity photo of the Doctor outside the TARDIS, and this set the precedent where photographic montages would be used on the covers of new Fifth Doctor books. So it was a little bit of I suppose vanity in the from Peter Davison. It's quite a tiny image I'm holding up to you there. I don't know if you can see it, but it's or whether you've seen it elsewhere.
I have it on Twitter right now. It was tweeted by @DW Cover Story in 1918. Well, I know my memory is going. Now I'm evidently on the wrong century and the wrong millennium. January 17th, 2018. So I will retweet this today on April 4th. If you're seeing this relatively close in time to the intended release date, which is going to be April 9th of 2023, you can go to my Twitter feed @Doctor Who Novels, @DrWho Novels. It is a really evocative cover photo. It's very dark. It's, as you say, it's a blaze. So it's a smoky red and black night sky, and then you have two versions of the android, and then Peter Davison looking at the camera, sort of with a come hither look, and he's holding up his famous Panama hat. In fact, the cover painting of Peter Davison closely resembles the photograph of Peter Davison on the cover of the book. So I wonder if the painting wasn't drawn from the same photo as a reference point, except Peter is looking a lot more suggestively at the camera in the painting than he is.
Yeah, I wondered that. If not the same photo, maybe the same photo shoot and a sort of slightly different angle of the head or something like that. Yeah.
So I'm putting this on Twitter now. If you hear me typing, you are hearing me type a tweet that you were looking at this exact minute, thanks to the electronic miracle of the internet.
Just so a little over a week ago, I actually came face to face with a pteroleptal.
Oh, Mark, you have the most fascinating love life.
Well, what can I say? I'm, I'm irresistible to pteroleptals. So yeah, there's quite near where I live, about 45 minutes drive away, is the Museum of Classic Science Fiction, which is an amazing little museum which Neil Cole, who's the proprietor, has built in his basement, and he has props from, I think, all first 7 Doctors, and obviously the ones from the 80s are better preserved, and there's more of them. And yeah, one of the really cool ones he's got is the last surviving pteroleptal costume. So this is the red pteroleptal. So it's one of the ones that you only see in part 4. One of the ones that very unsuccessfully tries to ambush the Doctor and Richard Mace.
Yes.
So this one, I think the others didn't survive the fire at Longleat when they used to have the exhibition of props and costumes at Longleat, and they unfortunately had a fire. And it's the one that was used in Mind Warp as the ambassador. When they sort of, I think, repainted it or sort of slightly changed it to look like a different alien.
That was Deep Roy's second and final Doctor Who cameo.
Ah, interesting. Yeah. So yeah, this is pretty cool. It's been restored by Neil, who's got the museum. So I'll send you a photo of that to tweet out as well. But yeah, if anybody's in the north of England, it's a fantastic museum to visit. I always try and give it a shout out and let people know about it. They've got next to the pteroleptal is a plasmaton from Time Flight. They've got the Garm from Terminus. They've got all manner of sort of costumes and cool bits and pieces. They've got hemovores and little kind of also some models and things. So it's an absolutely amazing place to visit, and it's the sort of things that you wouldn't see on display in the bigger Doctor exhibitions. So like the Doctor Experience that used to be in Cardiff, or the Worlds of Wonder that's currently on tour, where they've got the kind of like the marquee names like the K1 robot and Davros. Yes. And things. These are maybe the more kind of one-off villains, but it's sort of no less of a thrill and fascinating to see them.
The ones only recognized by the die-hard fans like us.
Yeah. I mean, they've got some. He's got some Cybermen and things like that as well, and he's got the baby, little green baby from Delta and the Bannermen, which is a little puppet.
Oh wow!
And he was saying he's also got Urak's head, which he's been putting on Instagram. That he's restoring that at the moment, and will be going on display this year. So I'll need to make another trip to see Urak.
So when would you have first read the book? Would you have read the book before seeing the rerun on UK Gold or after?
Yeah, I'm sure I'd have read it before. Really, that was because I only started watching midway through season 25, and then I read a lot of books between season 25 and 26, and then just devoured them where I could find them. After that, I would be searching in secondhand bookshops and W.H. Smith's and anywhere I could. So yeah, I'm pretty sure I'd have read it during that time. Yeah, I can't specifically remember reading it, but yeah, that definitely would have been when I was a kid. I would have read it.
As I mentioned earlier in the cold open, and I say earlier, and I say that for the benefit of the listener because you have not heard it yet, and I have not recorded it yet. But I have written it, and it will be in the cold open that will precede this wibbly wobbly, squirmy wormy. I've mentioned that this was one of my very first novelizations. It was in the second batch that I got, and I had started watching Doctor Who with Peter Davison, primarily seasons 20 and 21. So, as a young fan, this was the first Peter Davison novelization that I owned, and it happened to be for a story that I had not yet seen on television. So it took an outsized importance in my life. The kicker is, in late 1985, my primary PBS station decided to move Doctor Who from 7 p.m. Monday to Friday to 11:30 p.m. Monday to Friday. And I was just about to turn 12 years old, and I was in junior high school, and staying up until 11:30 each night was after my bedtime except on Fridays. So beginning with Meglos Part 2, I only saw Doctor Who one night a week. And because my parents were watching TV and we only had one VCR, and we did not have the kind of VCR that could tape one channel while you're watching another. This was very early days for the home video cassette recorder. If I didn't see it on Friday night, I wouldn't see it at all. So I saw Part 4 of Castrovalva. Did not see any of For the Doomsday. I saw Part 1 of Kinda, and I saw Part 2 of The Visitation. So my parents had actually watched a little bit of Part 1 the night before because they were trying to figure out why I liked this show so much. And they were telling me about the parts that they saw. And I still recall my mother was imitating Richard Mace saying, "Fortune has made me itinerant." I guess that line stuck with her the 24 hours after she watched the episode. She would have no recollection of it now, nearly 40 years later. So I loved this book, and I read it over and over again. And for the longest time, all I was able to see was Part 2. And this, of course, leads to another story that I'll retell when Earthshock comes on this show in a couple of months. Earthshock Part 1 aired on a Friday night. I was able to see that. Earthshock Part 4 didn't air until the following Wednesday after my bedtime, still in 7th grade. So I begged my mother to let me tape Doctor Who for this one night. So I set the VCR 11:30 to 11:55, and my mother was watching another show, probably The Tonight Show, fell asleep, woke up at 11:51, and immediately changed the channel to channel 21. So all I got of Earthshock were the last 3.5 minutes. And that was one of many notable VCR malfunctions that I've had for Doctor Who. You will also hear me talk about VCR malfunctions for Logopolis and the Five Doctors. Only the best stories got VCR malfunctions.
Yeah.
Although at least I got to see Adric's death, but I missed the first 20 minutes of the episode prior to that. So the Visitation I didn't tape record. I only saw Part 2 in the wild, and then it came around PBS 2 or 3 years later. So I finally got to see it, and of course I have the DVD and I have the Blu-ray, and I wouldn't say that it's one of my top 5, possibly not even one of my top 10 Davison stories, but it's a well-made story, and it's a well-told story. And I guess we should talk about the elephant in the room, which I'll be mentioning during my audio essay after the break. This is Eric Sayward's arrival to our little world. But this is, point that I'll make later. I'm curious if you're going to agree with a point that you haven't heard me make yet. This is not anything at all like the Eric Sayward that we are going to come to know very well between season 19 and season 23. This is early days for Eric, and this is not going to be his typical Doctor Who story at all.
No, it isn't, is it? It's quite interesting like that, and it's interesting sort of reading back. I don't think I'd fully appreciated before that this is his first ever TV script. It's not just his first Doctor Who script. He'd only written for radio before this,
Right.
and then on the back of his first ever TV script, he's offered the script editor role on Doctor Who. It just seems like this is just like a different world, isn't it? Like TV's so hard to break into now, and it was. Quite a sort of different world. But you often hear these sort of behind the scenes thing from people who'd worked on Doctor Who in the '60s when they're interviewed on things like Toby Haydock's Who's Round, and they would just sort of write in and say, "Oh, I'd love to work for the BBC or be a cameraman or something," and they would sort of get brought in and apprenticed like that. So it's just a very different world. But yeah, I think some of the things in the complete history on this story. It talks about how he was a bit unfamiliar with Doctor Who. He'd seen it when he was younger and sort of aimed it more in that mode with the historical side of it, which I think married with his interests as well, because he'd studied history, and his partner at the time was studying this period as well, about the Great Fire of London and the plague and that kind of thing. So yeah, he was able to use that, and obviously the character of Richard Mace he imported from his radio plays as well.
This leads to a couple of interesting points. Number one, we are just entering the era of the target books in publication order when the author is allowed a dedication page. So this book starts on page 9, whereas most other target books prior to this started on page 7. And the person to whom the Visitation is dedicated is For Paula, with fondest love. That is the Paula who would later be credited as Paula Moore, the credited writer for Attack of the Cybermen, a season 22 story, to which evidently she did not contribute one word of the script, depending on who you ask. And on the making of Attack of the Cybermen on the original DVD, there are several different people at once taking credit for having written Attack of the Cybermen, including one Ian Levine. The next book after this one, which I'm holding up now, which I haven't recorded yet, this is going to be the following week's episode, Full Circle, also has a dedication page. Castrovalvo, which is coming up in a couple of months on this podcast, also has a very funny dedication. This is not something we were seeing in the target books before, but it's a little bit of the evolution and the maturity of the line. The author is now getting a page to thank whoever they so choose. You can imagine that when Terrence Dix was writing 9 books a year, he very quickly would have run out of people to whom to dedicate his novels. Next question. This is a thought experiment. So Christopher H. Bidmead asks for a large raise because he was doing double or triple duty throughout season 18. He doesn't get it. Anthony Root is assigned on a 90-day attachment as an intern script editor. Christopher H. Bidmead had already greenlit For the Doomsday and had greenlit the earliest version of Kinda. My recollection is that he actually did some script editing work on part 1 of Kinda, and then he left. Anthony Root had a really difficult time keeping the store together, especially because John Nathan Turner was frequently overseas at conventions in America and was not always around to answer questions. Barry Letts was just finishing his 1 year as executive producer. One of the very last things that Barry Letts contributed to the show, and you can see this in the production note file on the season 19 Blu-ray on the For the Doomsday disc, he writes Anthony Root a note to For the Doomsday. This story needs a complete top to bottom rethink, and I'm finished, so I can't do it for you. So Anthony Root needs somebody to take over for him after his 90 days are up. The earliest scripts, Christopher Bailey, not sure if he would have been a good choice for script editor. He was more theatrical, and Kinda is a rather abstract story. Not sure that would have made him an ideal script editor. Maybe it would have made him a great script editor. But you're looking for somebody who can churn things out. The two guys from Meglos had submitted a story that was canceled. They're obviously not a good choice for the script editor. Terrence Dudley on Fort of Doomsday. That script wasn't great, according to Barry Letts. You can see why he wasn't recommended. This script for The Visitation comes over the transom. Anthony Root is like, oh, this guy can form a sentence and can tell a story. He's hired. So that's probably how he got the job. Just he was there's an American comedian slash director slash writer slash former movie star whose famous saying is 90% of success is just showing up. And that's how Eric Sayward got the Doctor Who job, just showing up, because nobody else did.
Yeah, right place at the right time. No, as you say, yeah, it is just that, isn't it? It's with no experience of or hardly any experience of TV writing, let alone script editing. It's sort of very much in at the deep end.
So last week, Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast did 90 minutes on The Visitation. Very good episode. I've tried very hard in my audio essay following this to not just parrot their points line for line. So I've been steering this conversation in different directions, so you can listen to both episodes on The Visitation, which came out on almost back-to-back weeks, and not be bored or feel repetition. So Visitation on TV features the destruction of the sonic screwdriver, and this was back in the days when the Doctor only had one. Nowadays, the sonic screwdriver is a huge part of the show, not just for storytelling purposes, but also for marketing. What was your take on the sonic screwdriver being destroyed, and did you have an emotional reaction to it?
I think this is something that I knew about before I even went into this story, because it's one of these sort of facts that is in books that I have that I used to pore over as a kid, like the what's it called? Is it it was sort of an A to Z. It was like the Universal Index or something like that. There was the program guide, the Universal Index, or the Universal Data Bank or something like that. And I think also those Doctor Who quiz books where there's 3 or 4 volumes of. And I think it was a sort of a fact I'd gleaned from books like that, because it was a sort of turning point in the series, wasn't it? Like, oh, in which story was it destroyed? And then it was never seen again in terms of the classic series. I feel like that was something I knew beforehand, that the sonic screwdriver is destroyed in this story and then never ever seen again. Which I think in the complete history, or I think it might be on the documentary Writing the Visitation, which is where Eric Sayward is being interviewed by it, and he says, well, he didn't realize it was a big deal. He thought the Doctor would just have a drawer full of them. But it was John Nathan Turner that sort of leapt on that and thought, yeah, I don't really like that anyway. Let's get rid of it from that point.
Although canonically, in universe, this is not the last appearance, because this was the second story filmed. Next story after this is Kinda. The sonic screwdriver appears in Kinda, but it's put out of commission because of Nissa's syncopal episode. And then the fourth episode produced, they had nobody to write a script for Peter Davison's debut story. So Christopher H. Bidmead, after leaving the show, agrees to come back and write a script to finish his own trilogy, even though it was never the plan for him to finish the trilogy. So when Christopher H. Bidmead comes back in Castor Valva, that is the last story produced with a sonic screwdriver in it until the TV movie in 1996. But I knew as a young fan this was the end of the line for the sonic screwdriver. So for me, when I got to that part in the book, I was, not emotional, but I thought, oh, R.I.P. Sonic Screwdriver. Then the Doctor has that nice line. I feel as if you just killed an old friend. Shortly after this comes Earthshock, where an old friend is literally killed. So that line is a little bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Richard Mace, Jim Sangster talked about this last week on the other podcast. He listened to the first 2 Richard Mace audio plays, but it's a Richard Mace from later on in history, so it is not a Richard Mace who lives in 1666. It's the same character, but Sayward changed his temporal location for the purpose of putting him in a Doctor Who story.
There's a splinter like Clara of the same.
You can only imagine Richard Mace jumping into the Great Intelligence, and all of a sudden Richard Mace appears in every single Doctor Who story trying to influence the Doctor's choices. So how does Richard Mace work for you? This is a story that already has 3 companions, but he is a pseudo-companion in it. I thought when I was a kid. I loved him in the book, and then of course my mother was imitating him, so she must have been taken with the accent. I think it's a terrific performance, and it's kind of a shame that he didn't come back elsewhere in the Sayward era and did not come back in any of the novels, because Jago and Lightfoot came back in one of the novels in the mid 1990s. It would have been great to see a missing adventure with the season 19 crew and Richard Mace teaming up, perhaps a few years later for a different point in British history.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, because you think the most likely thing, I guess, would have been Eric Sayward wanting to bring him back once he took over as script editor, in another story, given that it's his creation and everything like that. I suppose it depends on whether he allowed the use in any of the missing adventures or past Doctor adventures as well. But yeah, it would have been great to see him again. I really like him in this. He's very well drawn. I think very well acted. The dialogue is very authentic, and he kind of gets as much to do or a bit more to do than some of the companions, doesn't he? When this is sort of shunted off to the TARDIS for like a couple of episodes to build the machine. Tegan's under mind control and that kind of thing. So yeah, it would. I suppose he is maybe taking a little bit of the companion's role, but he's such an enjoyable character. I don't really begrudge him it.
Yeah, Tegan gets brainwashed. Nyssa is banished to the TARDIS to work on a science project, and Adric sprains his ankle as if he were Susan Foreman or Joe Grant.
Yeah. Yeah, he does a lot of just sort of running from place to place as well, doesn't he? And it's I suppose a story that maybe as a 3-parter would have been that bit tighter, and there'd have been less of just Nyssa pottering around the TARDIS and Adric running away from villagers and things.
But again, this is a serial, which implies installments over a period of nights, and not a 75-minute episode of a K-drama and not a 45-minute episode of a weekly TV show. If you start saying, well, this story is 2 episodes too long, all of a sudden you have a lot less Doctor Who. I don't think any of us want that.
No, that's true. That's true. But Sayward he didn't really take the opportunity in the book to sort of tighten any of it up, did he? It's a fairly blow-by-blow account in the book. Barring, two things that I think most memorable things for me from the TV story aren't in the book, which is odd. So one of them being the bit where the android picks up the scythe in the barn, so to sort of complete the look of the Grim Reaper. So he's already got the kind of the cape and the death mask. And then he picks up the scythe from the guy who's going to behead the Doctor and Richard Mace. So you have that moment of seeing him, kind of fully looking like the Grim Reaper, which is I think find really memorable from seeing the TV story, because probably not long after I got into Doctor Who, I also really fell in love with the Terry Pratchett Discworld books, where Death is one of the prominent characters. I think he appears in every single book, and then some of the books are about him. And he's just one of the best characters in it. He's amazing. So I probably made that connection the first time I saw the Visitation and thought, oh, that's really cool, because that's Death. So that bit isn't in the book, although it is kind of a visual thing, I suppose. But you could have got the frightened villagers' reaction to seeing him with the scythe. And then the other bit is a really small bit, but I always really liked it, is when Adric is asking, when the Doctor's searching London for the pteroleptals, and he said, oh, you know where they are? And the Doctor very sarcastically says, yes, that's why I'm looking. That's not in either. He just says, in the book, he says, do you know where he is? And the Doctor says, not yet. So, yeah, it makes it wonder if that wasn't a Sayward line, whether it was ad-libbed by Peter Davison on the day of recording or something like that.
It sounds like an ad-lib. Peter was always trying to add humor and a more sarcastic edge to the character, and JNT was resistant because I think he'd had enough of Tom Baker doing ad-libs when he was the production unit manager during the Graham Williams era. So he did not want the humor on the show, and Peter wanted to bring it in however he could, leading to a lot of great non-verbal bits of comedy from Peter Davison later in his tenure. So the book is considering that it starts on page 9, it is only 113 pages of text, so it is almost 1979 Terrence Dicks sized. And Jim Sangster points this out on the other show last week, and I'll thank him when he's on this show next week. The
Mhm.
first 10 minutes of the Visitation is all TARDIS scenes, and then, of course, other goings on with tertiary characters. So when I was fast forwarding through part 1 last night to locate the audio clip that I wanted for the next half of this show, the regulars don't exit the TARDIS until 10 minutes in, which is almost half of episode 1 before they get to Black Park. And it's even later than that they finally meet Richard Mace. Sayward deletes from the book all of the continuity scenes linking back to Kinda, the previous story, where the Doctor is telling off Adric. As the cast are recording this, they had not even filmed Kinda yet, so it's all gibberish to them.
Mhm.
So all that material is taken out of the book because Kinda had also not yet been novelized, this being the first Peter Davison book. So all that stuff could go. So the TARDIS crew doesn't appear in chapter 1. That's the prologue, which I love, but they make it out of the TARDIS within 5 pages of chapter 2. So they join the action a lot faster than they did on television. That's the primary cut. Other points Jim brought up on the other show. Some of the visuals are different. There are holograms instead of black and white video monitors. And as you say,
Mhm.
Peter's a little more sarcastic. But talking about me as an American who didn't always have a cultural frame of reference for understanding Doctor Who, number one, I didn't know about the Great Fire of London. So the last line of the book puzzled me until about a year later when I did learn about the Great Fire of London. When I was in London in 2018 and 2019, I made it a point to visit Pudding Lane, and then my daughter and I climbed the Fire of London monument. So we've been to the top of that, which commemorates the blaze. I think it was Christopher Wren, if memory serves me right, who built the monument, and you can climb all the way up, and there's great views of London from the top. So we have climbed the Great Fire Monument, and you get a certificate on your way out for having climbed it. So we have that on our refrigerator. So that was a
Excellent.
fun little afternoon in London last time I was there. Now 4 years ago. Would love to go back. Probably not this year though. So how important was the Great Fire of London to you as part of your British upbringing, and what was your reaction when you learned that this was the root cause for the Great Fire of London, a pterodactyl machine going kablooey because of the Doctor?
Yeah, I definitely already knew the story about the Great Fire of London, so it was probably we'd covered it at school by that point. I definitely know it's Pudding Lane. I think it's the name Pudding Lane is very memorable. I don't think there's that many kind of street names that are so famous and linked to big historical things that I can't think of any off the top of my head. But I think Pudding Lane being quite a fun name makes it stick in your head as the origin of the fire. So yeah, I definitely would have. I definitely do remember. In fact, remember knowing what the significance of that was when the TARDIS materializes and it says Pudding Lane. But yeah, I guess that isn't something that probably travels outside the UK particularly well. I think the kind of very simple version of history where the Great Fire of London halted the plague by kind of burning all the rats out. I think is something we're taught at school pretty young.
Pudding Lane is still there. I've been on it on my way to the monument. Have you ever climbed the monument? You might enjoy that.
I haven't. I hadn't heard of it until you mentioned it there, to be honest. But I've hardly spent any time in London because I live at the other end of the country. So yeah, I haven't spent all that much time in London at all. But I will definitely look out for that next time I'm there.
You live closer to Hadrian's Wall, which is a much, much shorter climb, only being a couple of feet high.
Yeah, very very close to Hadrian's Wall, actually. Yeah, it's there's the little bits of it that are left anyway. Yeah.
And I should also point out that coming from the States and coming from a non-Christian household, the first time that I'd ever heard of the Grim Reaper came from this book. So I'd never heard of the Grim Reaper before. And I think in the novelization, he's referred to as the Great Reaper. So
Right.
it took me a while to make the connection. My father, not a Doctor Who fan in any way, shape, or form, but he is a big science fiction fan. and he was a voracious reader of Piers Anthony. And Piers Anthony did a whole series of books about a regular guy who is drafted into the role of becoming the Grim Reaper. So my father tried to get me to read those books and try to graduate me from Doctor Who to more complex science fiction. Didn't take, never really got into Piers Anthony, but this was the first time that I'd ever heard of the idea of a Grim Reaper.
Right. Yeah. Again, I probably it was probably the Terry Pratchett books that would have introduced me to it. Because Death or the Grim Reaper on those, that he's always on the cover, and it's always that sort of skeleton face, black cloak, scythe. I don't know if they're that popular over in the States or if he's very well known over there. He died a few years ago now, Terry Pratchett. I've actually still got the last one of his books. I've never brought myself to read it because then there'll be no more for me to read. I do need to get around to that at some point. But I've reread a lot of them many times, and they are brilliant.
I have heard of Terry Pratchett, of course, but I didn't learn about him until several years after I discovered Doctor Who. So in 1985, at age 11, I would have had no frame of reference.
Yeah.
But is there anything else we can say about The Visitation? I think it's a very good TV story. I think it's a very good novelization. And the fact that Eric Sayward went in such different directions for his later TV scripts and his later books, I think this may be one of his best.
Yeah, because he's generally sort of quite self-deprecating about his work anyway, isn't he? But I know on the documentary that's on the season 19 Blu-ray, he talks about how he thinks it's just sort of basic and workmanlike. But it's a story I always really enjoy. It's kind of I always forget how much I like it till I start watching it, really. But I think it looks great. It's always very visually pleasing and interesting one. I suppose one of the things that he introduces into the novelization that probably feeds into my kind of perception as well of it being very kind of green and rural is he talks about wild animals quite a bit. The opening is Elizabeth looking out the window, and there's an owl, I think, catching a mouse, and there's a fox and all that kind of stuff. And then a little bit later on, there's a badger that sort of pops his head out and watches some of the proceedings, isn't there? So he's sort of bringing all that into it as well.
And these are literary devices that Doctor Who novelizations don't often use. Tony Witt made this point on the other show last week, but in the novelization of The Green Death, you have the point of view of a maggot. So here, having the point of view of various woodsy animals commenting on the plot is a really neat little technique that draws you into the story, and it is not something that Eric Sayward is going to do again until he novelizes Revelation of the Daleks more than 35 years after he novelizes this one.
Yeah, it's and Resurrection of the Daleks. You don't get a point of view, but you get the talking cat in that one, don't you? So he's.
And I will say to everybody that I did cover with Mark the Resurrection of the Daleks novelization when it first came out in 2018 or so, that I was courteously deferential of the book. I was not giving you my true opinion. I was trying to be polite because it was somebody else's show. I think it's one of the most god-awful Doctor Who books ever written. And when it comes back around on this podcast, probably in a couple of years, you will hear my full, unexpurgated opinion on the Resurrection of the Daleks novelization.
Well, as we talked about when we did The Power of the Doctor on Trap 1, I do think that an element of that book has been put into canon where Tegan at the end of the book becomes sort of super powered and is able to leap off Tower Bridge onto a passing boat. There is that bit in The Power of the Doctor when she's in that kind of shaft on the ladder and she falls, and then you just sort of see her coming out at the end. She's sort of dusting herself down. So I think that is Chris Chibnall canonizing that idea from the Resurrection of the Daleks novelization.
I should have asked him that when I saw him for 45 seconds on the autograph line at Gallifrey 1.
Yes, that's the most burning question.
If anybody sees Chris Chibnall in the months to come, please ask him and send me the answer.
Yes, definitely. I'd love to know that.
Speaking of answers, you know what it's time for? All right, Mark, I have picked at random from the archives 1. Doctor Who serial between 1963 and 2022, courtesy of the randomizer.net. So you have 20 questions to guess which serial it is anywhere between 1963 and 2022. What is your first question?
Well, my first question is going to follow my standard tactics of choosing one story, so that if by the very, very long odds it's correct, then I will be the unassailable champion for all time. I have a couple of times in the past, I think, chosen The Visitation, which it seems like it's more unlikely because it's the story we're talking about, but equally that isn't any more unlikely than any other. So I'm not going to be put off. I'm going to say, are you The Visitation?
That's a great bit of synchronicity. Imagine if it was The Visitation on The Visitation show. It has not yet happened that the 20 questions show of the week is the book of the week, but no, lamentably, I am not 20 questions. Question 2.
Are you another 20th century story?
I am another 20th century story. So you've cut out half of the series now. Question 3.
Are you in color or black? Are you in color?
I am in color. So now you've eliminated the 1960s entirely. Question 4, narrowing it down.
Are you from the 1980s?
I am from the 1980s. Question 5. Now, I want to point out to you, Mark, the 1980s covers the back end of season 17 up through season 26. You have a lot of choices, but if you guess it in one, you will have robbed for all time the Conrad crown of 20 questions champion.
Right. I feel like I've got to take a guess then. I will go for... I'll just go for an all-time classic. I'll go Silver Nemesis. Are you Silver Nemesis?
Oh my goodness. Conrad? You know, Conrad listens to the show every week wearing his crown. Unfortunately, as of today, the 4th of April, he'll find out a few days later, Conrad's crown has just been took. It is.
No way.
It is. It is Silver Nemesis, because that is a story that I know you are disturbingly fond of.
I'm incredibly enamored of Silver Nemesis because it's the second story I ever saw, and it was the one that really cemented me as a fan at 8 years old. And I've just written an entry for the next Inside Out book, which I think is coming out later in the year. And I've did a guest appearance on another podcast about it. And when you mentioned earlier, Trap One are doing our anniversary series of podcasts about all the anniversary stories, that was the first one I put my name down for, Silver Nemesis, because I absolutely love it. So I just picked that as the first 80s story that came into my head because I love it so much. I did not expect that to pay off. That's fantastic.
Well, Conrad will be on this show in a couple of weeks, and Conrad is now going to have to get his crown back, and he's going to have to do, I think, the randomizer, because it's going to be hard to narrow down the entirety in just 5 questions the way that you have. But Mark is now our reigning champion, and Conrad, we will do whatever it takes to help Conrad get his crown back, short of giving him the answer. So my apologies. I hope Conrad doesn't stop listening to the show, and I hope Conrad doesn't stop guest hosting Trap One, because his crown has been taken away. But it lasted a good. That crown lasted a good long time. So he was, hopefully he will be the reigning champion for longer than anybody else. So we'll see if someone's going to come and take your crown away.
Well, thank you very much. That's absolutely made my week, and I do apologize to Conrad, but he had a good run.
All right, I think on that note, we should wrap up before Conrad unsubscribes entirely and I lose one of my best listeners. Mark, have a great night, buddy. Catch you next time.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Doctor Who and the Visitation by Eric Sayward, televised as The Visitation. Teleplay by Eric Sayward, televised in February 1982, published in August 1982. Tegan, the young air hostess who quite unintentionally became a member of the TARDIS's crew, wants to return to her own time. But when the Doctor tries to take her back to Heathrow Airport in the 20th century, the TARDIS lands instead on the outskirts of 17th century London. The Doctor and his companions receive a decidedly unfriendly welcome, but it soon becomes clear that the sinister activities of other visitors from time and space have made the villagers extremely suspicious of outsiders. And as a result of the aliens' evil schemes, the Doctor finds himself on the point of playing a key role in a gruesome historical event. This is, as I said during the cold open, the arrival of Eric Sayward to Doctor Who. It's the novelization of his first script. From here on out, he'll serve as script editor for the better part of the next 5 TV seasons from 1982 onward. So many of the books coming up for the rest of 2023 on this podcast, and it's only early April as I record this, will be from his tenure on the show. And we'll probably be seeing him deep into 2024 as well. My various guests and I will have a lot to say about his time on the show, both positive and negative. But this book, I'm not going to have much negative to say. I also mentioned earlier that the Target Book Club podcast covered this last week. If you compare our opinions on respective books, there's not always a lot of overlap, but Tony and Dalton and Jim were very bullish on this book last week, and so too here will I be. So too here will... Is that syntactically correct? Anyway, point is, they liked it. I like it. They all raised great points. Anytime I hear Jim speak, I always want to resign from this show and just let him drive it. So what I'll try to do this morning is not merely parrot their talking points. Instead, I'm largely adapting this essay from the review that I wrote for the Doctor Who Ratings Guide back in late 2016. There will be some similarities between their show and mine, but all of the following opinions are very much my own. Sayward, in novelizing his TV scripts, spends a lot of time in the Visitation describing scenery and foliage. This is, to be sure, not an indicator of what Sayward's future TV scripts, TV rewrites, and novelizations are going to look like. In fact, you could almost mistake the opening pan of his first few paragraphs on page 9 for a gentle, natured travelogue. Putting on your best Sir David Attenborough voice, it was a warm summer evening. The rays of the setting sun bathed the old manor house in subtle shades of red and gold. Evening stars appeared as the light continued to fade. From a high branch, a sleepy owl watched a fox break cover and silently pad toward the west wing of the manor house. Night was awakening. This is a very elegant and evocative opening pan, very much not in the Target house style of Terrance Dicks, but shortly after that, Sayward also lets us know that this is not some gentle documentary narrated by Sir David. Quote, "The owl, now fully awake, stared fixedly, saucer-eyed, at a shadow below. Suddenly he launched himself into space, and on silent wings, talons extended, sped towards a tiny harvest mouse. A moment later, the bird's hooked beak was tearing at his supper. It was the first kill of the evening." Let me say that again. It was the first kill of the evening. That's a pretty genius thing to bury in the opening pan. There are about to be several more kills that same evening, including the family inside that manor house. A retired knight and his 2 teenage children, all named after British royalty, are about to be massacred by the Pteroleptals, aliens who've crash-landed on Earth in the year 1666. With this moment, Eric Sayward truly arrives in a fountain of blood. Page 18. Several bolts of lightning were hurled against the horrified trio. A moment later, all that remained of the family were 3 charred, smoking bodies. The Visitation is the first of Sayward's 6 Doctor Who novelizations. He would later effect an over-the-top, sub-Douglas Adams style in his next 3 Colin Baker books. He would also, in his 21st century Colin Baker book, the long-delayed novelization of Revelation of the Daleks, reuse that first kill of the evening line to much less effect. But set aside our knowledge of the future for a moment. We're still in 1982, August. Not a great month for me. I was surviving a terrible year at summer camp, and in the middle of a brutal 15-game Mets losing streak, which did not shatter my Mets fandom, even at 8 years old. So, forgetting that, let's just treat Sayward as a promising newcomer who's turned in an excellent rookie volume. Doctor Who and the Visitation is a refreshing read, because Sayward at this early date is playing it straight. The book is witty but dry. It adheres closely to his own TV scripts, cutting out a lot of dialogue, padding continuity references from the TV Part 1. You'll notice that in Part 1 on TV, the TARDIS crew doesn't actually exit the TARDIS until the 10-minute mark. In the book, they get out a lot faster. Several characters will comment on how exhausted the story's events have left them. An earnest way of masking the fact that, on TV, this was not the most action-packed story. But Sayward propels the narrative through the characters' stamina levels. Dalton, on the other show last week, pointed out something I'd missed, that Sayward describes what the characters are doing with their hands as shorthand for revealing their emotional state. I'll never forget on that first read in 1985 how tired and frustrated I felt on Nissa's behalf during her epic struggle with the TARDIS sonic booster in the Part 3 material. Sayward puts us right inside her emotional and physical state. Sayward's TV hallmarks are soon to be unflinching violence and massive body counts. But with The Visitation being his first story, we see an energetic new writer, experimenting with pacing and figuring out how much action the cast can bear. These will no longer be problems by his next story, Earthshock, compared to which The Visitation is a polite comedy of manners. Which means that The Visitation is as small-scale in print as it is on TV, with no additional scenes or subplots added for the book. The story is a pseudo-historical, which doesn't intersect with actual history until the final punchline. The latest recurrence of the Black Death is mentioned in the background, but never directly experienced by any character. The village where the Pteroleptals land is never named. The Pteroleptals plan on releasing a genetically engineered version of bubonic plague to wipe out humanity, but unusually for Doctor Who, not a single person is ever infected. One suspects that the whole story might have been engineered backwards from the final shot of the Pudding Lane sign. Eric Sayward had decided that the TARDIS crew must have been partly responsible for setting the Great Fire of London, and needed to contrive a reason for a bunch of flammable alien technology to have gone kaboom. And of course, I don't need to tell you that at age 11, the first time I ever learned about the Great Fire of London, living here in New York, was through chapter 11 of this book. As for the TARDIS crew, here we have a young Fifth Doctor. This was only the second Peter Davison story produced, and the first to be novelized. Davison had been cast by J&T as a direct contrast to Tom Baker's larger-than-life Fourth Doctor. Peter's TV hallmarks were earnestness, charm, and vulnerability. And as he'd much later be associated with the Sixth Doctor's brutality, Sayward here is actually effective at capturing these more genteel traits. For example, quote, "The Doctor found he was wagging his finger at the Pteroleptal leader, like an angry schoolteacher might at a difficult class of children. He felt silly, and even more frustrated because he had been reduced to such a ridiculous gesture." I also like how the Doctor shoots down a Tegan observation with, quote, "more pomposity than he intended," or when he greets the Pteroleptals, quote, "as jauntily as his apprehension would allow." Sentences like this, in addition to Davison's own performance on the show, which only got more relaxed and more funny over time, are the reason why the Fifth Doctor became my Doctor. The main guest role on TV, as in the book, is Richard Mace, a failed 17th century actor turned highwayman, whom Sayward borrowed from his own previous radio plays, with Mace having been a 19th century actor and theater manager. Mace is described humorously in the book, for example, flourishing his pistols, quote, "with considerably more flamboyance than the situation demanded." Mace also spends a lot of time in the text daydreaming about how to take the Pteroleptal technology and apply it to the theater so that he can become rich and famous. It's a shame there's no epilogue showing Mace bringing these dreams to fruition. Later, when Mace yells at the Pteroleptal leader, Sayward observes, quote, "Such was the dignity the actor managed to get into such a banal statement, the Doctor almost wanted to cheer." This is terrific prose, and I think it's the reason why I was so disappointed with Sayward's later books. He very, very rarely in the future is going to write sentences and observations as genuine as these. But then again, Richard Mace is his own character. He perhaps has a lot more emotional investment in Mace than he would in any of the characters that he wrote for example, the rewrites of The Twin Dilemma or Attack of the Cybermen. Let's give a listen to some Richard Mace hard at work.
This is home?
For the last night or two, fortune has made me itinerant.
Why were those men following us?
You don't know.
Well, we're new to the area.
You must be new to the world, sir. Have not you heard? There is plague
Where?
everywhere. That is why the village is guarded so vigilantly. They are terrified of strangers and the pestilence they may carry.
Of course, the reason for the sulfuric smoke, purification fires.
Is that why you're not staying in the village?
Alas, because of the plague, everywhere is unfriendly.
Hence, the guns.
Oh, not entirely. I was once a noted thespian, until forced into rural exile by the closure of the theatres. But it is only with the aid of these properties I am able to command the attention of an audience nowadays.
You sound like a highwayman or a robber.
A gentleman of the road, madam. Richard Mace, at your service.
The companions are also captured well, especially because in the book the endless on-screen Season 19 bickering is kept to a bare minimum. We'll spend a lot of time with Nyssa as she tries to defeat the pteroleptal android with a science project, and we'll spend a lot of time with Tegan as she fights against being the pteroleptal's prisoner. Adric, however, is given much less POV, and in fact he sprains his ankle on television as if he were Susan or Joe Grant, and Sayward allows the main guest star to reflect what might well have been Sayward's own private thoughts. Quote, Mace scowled. Foolish boy, he thought. In terms of structure, the most graphic violence that Sayward commits here is to nuke the prevailing target house style. Over the last couple of dozen episodes here on Doctor Who Literature, we've grown used to novelizations of 4-part TV stories condensed into 12 chapters in print, with cliffhangers neatly placed at the ends of chapters 3, 6, and 9. Sayward instead writes to a poorly divisible 11-chapter count. The cliffhangers are all buried in mid-chapter, with positively no dramatic flourishes. In fact, the Part 1 cliffhanger is stuck blandly in mid-paragraph, such that when I first read the book as a child, months before seeing the story on PBS, I had no idea where Part 1 could possibly have ended. Sayward also prefers to end chapters at brief moments of disquiet, rather than grand tension. At the end of Chapter 3, quote, Mace scowled. He was not happy. Chapter 7 ends not with the pteroleptal android breaking down a door, but rather a few beats later, as the android is leading the Doctor and Mace away toward captivity. This is very different from Terrence Dicks's chapter-ending style, which expertly created moments of tension and drama out of ordinary reaction shots on TV. Sayward prefers to leave you hanging on moments of ambiguity or defeat, the same way that most of Charles M. Schulz's Peanuts comic strips usually ended on the panel after the punchline, with Linus, or Charlie Brown, or Schroeder, or Lucy reacting to the punchline. And I think with that last sentence, I may be the first person in history to compare the fiction styles of Eric Sayward with Charles M. Schulz, by the way. Sayward also contents himself to spend a lot of time writing from the POV of animals. When the pteroleptal escape pod crashes, Sayward describes it from the POV of a fox, quote, who panicked and fled into the night. We also briefly spend time in the head of the miller's horse and donkey. Quote, Mace snorted. The donkey joined in sympathy. Later on, a badger briefly tries to follow the action, but loses interest, opting instead to set off in search of supper. Sayward uses the grandeur of nature, at times, to offset the death and destruction. Quote, Nature had decided to show herself at her best, to convince those who had time to consider such things that she was capable of creating more than the plague, fear, and violent death. But the Doctor and Richard Mace were among those too preoccupied to appreciate the gesture. This is real novel writing. This is not just a cheap, disposable novelization written over a weekend. Even though the book is only 113 pages of text, you really get the sense that Sayward is writing to a very literary style, talking about nature, the point of view of animals, and what characters are feeling, and what they're doing with their hands to express their emotional states. These are not tricks that you're going to find in the majority of Target books. Even the Terrence books, as much time as I have spent cavelling about Terrence over the last year and a half of this show, which only makes me more disappointed that the next 5 Eric Sayward books we're going to be discussing over the life of this podcast are, to the best of my memory, not going to be relying on these tricks too much. The Visitation is his first story, and I guess there's a really good argument that it's his best. Let's listen to some more dialogue from the television.
Drop the sonic device.
Isn't my day, is it? I feel as though you've just killed an old friend.
It is with some sadness that I tell you, you are about to join it.
Why not smile and let me live?
If I did that, you would be more of a menace than all the primitives on this planet.
You overestimate me.
And then there would be the argument over the TARDIS. You would have made a useful ally. But I'm afraid I think you are better dead. I said I would demonstrate how I am to rid this planet of all its primitives. It's very simple.
The poor old black rat and his flea.
The infection it now carries has been genetically re-engineered. Although heavily infected, it will outlive you all.
But you'd need thousands of them.
I have thousands of them. They are awaiting release in a nearby city. Their infection will kill every living thing.
I thought the local plague was already doing that.
But our rats will ensure that there are no survivors. A final visitation.
On TV, The Visitation benefits from 2 really strong guest performances. Mace and the Pterolepta leader, the focuses of my 2 main audio excerpts today. It's also an interesting early look at what fresh young energy Peter Davison brought to the role of the Fifth Doctor. The Visitation does not fall on too many top 20 lists. The novelization is correspondingly small, and has rarely held up as a model of the form. However, like Tony and Dalton and Jim on the other show last week, I love this book, and for many reasons. Sayward's dry wit, his crisp and literary prose, the earnest storytelling, and a plot not trying as desperately hard as Sayward's later novelizations to be funny or acidic or Douglas Adamsy. It's also a plot not trying as desperately hard as some of the creative decisions within season 22 for that matter, but that is a story for quite a bit down the road on this podcast. It's also, when all is said and done, the only Doctor Who novel is Doctor Who and the Visitation to feature the point of view of a badger. For that reason, if nothing else, this is definitely a Target novelization worth reading, in any order. Next time, on Doctor Who literature, our brief foray into Season 19 comes to an end. It's going to be several more months in real time and several more weeks on this podcast before we go back to Season 19. Instead, we are going back to Season 18, and we are going back to one of my absolute all-time favorite Doctor Who stories. It is the first story of a trilogy. It features on television some of my favorite understated guest performances. It features some absolutely ferocious work by Tom Baker and some of my favorite bits of dialogue. Not talking about the Leisure Hive, not talking about State of Decay, not talking about Keeper of Traken, not talking about Logopolis, which is yet to come on this show. There's a lot of Season 18 stories to which those descriptions could apply. But next week, Mr. Jim Sangster is back on this show to show me how it's done. We're going to talk about novelizations that include original poetry. We're going to be talking about a novelization that gives first names to some of its characters. You do not have them on television. And we are going to talk about a novelization written by somebody who is barely out of his teens, but which reflects the maturity of somebody at least twice that age. Next week, when Mistfall comes, Jason and Jim will leave the swamp and bring you a tale of Doctor Who, full circle. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. Special thanks to my special guest, Mark McManus from Trap One Podcast. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels. You can find me on email at DoctorWhoLiterature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Our new logo was designed by Jim Sangster, who is also now, from here on out, a producer on this show. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.